Why do people vote for Republicans? Well, I encourage you to check out my previous two videos on why do people vote for Democrats and why people vote for and support Donald Trump. Today we're going to be talking about Republicans generally. We're not going to be singling out Trump, but Trump does play a role in some of this. We're going to definitely talk about what the Republican Party was like before Trump, who was in the picture, and kind of what the Republican Party is like during Trump, even though the Republicans have not had a non-Trump presidential candidate since 2012. I know, isn't it insane that it's been 12 years? But yeah, let's get into this. So the Republican Party has been around since the mid-1800s. It's the party of Lincoln. That's something that a lot of Republican voters seem to strongly cling to. They feel a sort of historical connection with the party, I would say. Think about the Republican Party and what they've traditionally had. Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Ulysses S. Grant, who isn't always considered a good president, but still. Calvin Coolidge, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan. A lot of these presidents are like just really iconic. I mean, Calvin Coolidge maybe less so, but a lot of libertarians really idolize him for his economic policy. So they've got a lot of these figures that they can point to as, historical models. Like, hey, when I think of voting Republican, I think of voting for someone like that. Then, we get to, the George W. Bush era, and the Republican Party's popularity starts to kind of fall off of a cliff. And now Donald Trump is in office and things are very polarized. But let's keep in mind that there are a lot of people who vote for and support Trump who aren't fans of the Republican Party. No, they will commonly say stuff like, the Republican establishment is out to get Trump. They'll say Mitch McConnell is a spineless loser who doesn't stand for conservative values. They'll probably blast Mike Johnson as being insufficiently conservative. So what are the types of people like? What are their reasons for voting for Republican candidates who are not Donald Trump? They either like Trump and like the Republican Party, or like the Republican Party but don't like Trump. Well, a lot of it does fall back on this sort of economic understanding that the free market is generally going to wield the best solutions. A lot of Republicans believe that. And as a fallback, they believe that even if the free market does bring about the best solutions, the free market is the most compatible way of managing the economy, or not managing the economy in a sense, with the Constitution. A lot of conservatives will say, I am a constitutional conservative. They'll talk about their support for separation of powers, something that Trump's not a fan of. The Second Amendment, the First Amendment, also something Trump's not a fan of. And really just limited government. One thing might be that they think a lot of economic regulation is unconstitutional. They think a lot of economic regulation is akin to socialism. They think that, they said, and a lot of them still do think that the Affordable Care Act was socialism. Now, was it? Not really, but it did increase the role of government in the U.S. economy. Conservatives are correct to recognize that. They're correct to recognize that universal health care would require government getting strongly involved in the healthcare industry in providing healthcare for its citizens. And even if they think there are some upsides to that, they're concerned about government overreach. Republicans will often point to things that the government manages poorly, and then they'll look at things that the left is advocating for, like universal health care, and say, hey, now, why would you want the government to manage health care when they can't manage these other things right? So that's something that kind of motivates them, is the belief that just the government isn't going to do things right. Another thing, and this is pretty much right alongside that, it's something that I think you see a lot of the more deep thinkers in the Republican Party talk about, which, yes, they do exist. I know it's fun to make fun of Republicans and Trump and George W. Bush, but there are figures within the Republican Party who can talk a lot about different theories of government, different constitutional values. But one big thing is states' rights. There are a lot of Republicans who purport to have a principled belief in states' rights. They think that a lot of these federal programs are just unconstitutional. They don't like administrative agencies at the federal level. They think that states should have a lot more discretion in going about things. Now, this also conflicts, of course, with something else that Republicans believe, sometimes, some Republicans believe, is the national abortion ban. They're supporters of this. So there's obviously different flavors of Republican. There are, as I said, those who believe in the Constitution, believe in limited government, and they propose the idea that limited government in the form of the economy is basically the most constitutionally sound way of managing the economy. They alternatively might argue that states' rights are the most important thing. They look at what the Democrats put forward and they say, that's too much involvement in the federal government for me. They might say, if blue states like California and New York and Maryland want to implement programs like what the Democrats are proposing at a national level, they'll say, hey, I'm okay with that, but I just don't know about the federal stuff. And that brings me to Mitt Romney, who, of course, in his home state of Massachusetts, when he was governor, essentially implemented the Affordable Care Act at a statewide level. And I do know a lot of Republicans who saw that and said, you know, it's at the statewide level. It's not the federal government like Obama, so I'm fine with it. You know, whatever. Let states do what they want. They'll often point out that if you don't like what your state's policies are, you can just move to a different state. Now, I would push back on that, not because I think it's impossible, but because I think it underestimates how difficult it can be to move from one state to another just because you don't like a policy. People set their roots in the state. People get jobs. People have family members. And yeah, obviously they can move with their family members, but maybe some of them not, you know? You're always sacrificing stuff when you move from one state to another. So yeah, there's a constitutional framework and the government framework. A lot of Republicans are also starting to become more invested in the culture war. We need to talk about Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis, at one point, kind of seemed like he would be the next Republican nominee. He seemed like he had a chance of beating Trump. There were legit left-wing commentators saying, this guy's on the rise. Now, obviously, it seems silly to believe that because Trump won really handily. But DeSantis had some serious momentum behind him. Remember that in 2022, he did very well in his state of Florida. He trounced the Democrat Charlie Crist. And in doing so, he campaigned on a lot of very, very socially conservative ideas and sort of swatted aside economics, not literally and not super broadly. He still did talk about it and, you know, COVID policy, which of course affects economics. But he really, really loved using the word woke. I mean, just woke this, woke that. I'm going to take on Disney for being woke and pro-LGBT. Really just aggressive social conservatism. You know, he said, Florida is where woke goes to die. Do you remember that speech after he won in 2022? Because I do, and that was actually kind of funny. But then you saw that Trump made fun of him for it, actually. He said, there are a lot of Republicans who just go around saying woke, and yet they can't even say what it means, so I don't like to use the word woke. It was a really interesting moment from Trump, because normally he seems to take basically any opportunity he can to attack the left and Democrats. So you'd think he'd love to call Democrats woke, just like Ron DeSantis does. But he also kind of wants to drive a wedge between himself and his opponent, Ron DeSantis. But so what does Ron DeSantis and the DeSantisite Republicans stand for? It's social conservatism. It's also some emphasis on freedom, really, really negative feelings toward vaccine mandates, negative feelings toward mask mandates. The COVID stuff is still fresh in their minds. Deep resentment toward Anthony Fauci. You know, Fauci lied, people died. I think DeSantis even said, don't Fauci my Florida. So if we want to look to why people vote Republican and not necessarily include Trump in the conversation in the year 2024, I think that DeSantis and his ideology are a big part of that. I think that there are plenty of other Republicans with different sorts of ideologies from DeSantis who are, you know, not quite as popular, but they're worth mentioning. Those would be types like Rand Paul. Now, does Rand Paul really talk about social issues all that much? No, not necessarily. I mean, he's actually been critical of a lot of U.S. foreign policy, being too hawkish, drug policy. he's a libertarian type. Same with his father, Ron Paul, who's more libertarian than him. And they're just like, yeah, no, we're not necessarily socially conservative, but we darn well disagree with the left and their pro-government agenda, or whatever they would say, their socialist agenda, welfare, what you name it, regulatory state, administrative state. So there was a lot of momentum behind Ron Paul. There still seems to be quite a bit behind Rand Paul, even though he did not do well in 2016. But I know a lot of Republican and conservative types who are not Trump fans. But if you ask them, who do you think is a really good Republican you'd like to see run for president? They will probably say Rand Paul pretty early on. So yeah, there's also kind of the false understanding among Republicans that motivates them to vote for Republicans because they see them as being more anti-war. They say, hey, I don't like that Biden supports Ukraine. I don't like all this money they're sending Ukraine. But at the same time, they also will, be principled and call out both sides in the sense that they'll say, I don't like that the Republicans are pro-Ukraine too. They think that the Republicans support Ukraine, and they're basically too big into foreign policy and neocon policy, but they think that they're better on it than the Democrats. And then ironically, guess what? There's another motivating factor on the other side. There are people who vote Republican, and I admit that this is probably kind of a shrinking population, but those who vote Republican because they think that Republicans care more about America, they represent America internationally better, and so they want a Republican for the foreign policy reasons. They think that Democrats abandon our allies. They think that the Democrats do not believe in a strong military. I mean, I do recall hearing a lot of arguments against Obama from Republicans that like, this guy is not a tough guy. He's a weak guy. He's a feminine man who doesn't believe in a big muscular military and standing up for our allies. They criticized him for not being nice enough to Israel. So there are the foreign policy Republican voters from both sides of the equation, the pro-war side and the anti-war side. Maybe that's an oversimplification. Maybe you could say the neocon and the paleocon side. I think that's probably better. But yeah, Pat Buchanan types, he's a paleocon. Neocon, George W. Bush, Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, Dick Cheney. There are still voters like that, believe it or not. Those guys aren't necessarily popular, especially Dick Cheney, but there are Americans who agree with some of their foreign policy ideas, and that's why they vote for Republicans. And they might not like Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy at times, because Trump is less of a neocon than George W. Bush or Dick Cheney, and they feel he does abandon our allies. So there's that. Next, we need to talk about the social issue thing for Republicans. And I'm not talking about the people who are socially conservative. I'm talking about people who might agree with Republicans on a handful of things. They might disagree with them on social policy, but they'll downplay the Republicans' views on social policies and just say, well, the Democrats are worse. So I'm talking about people who actually are kind of libertarian. They're socially progressive, but they'll attempt to justify their voting for Republicans by saying, well, it's kind of a wash, or the Democrats are worse. And what do I mean by that? So I mean, if you're someone who goes on social media, you will probably see Republicans saying stuff like, Democrats are the real party of racists. It was the Democrats who formed the KKK. It was the Democrats who were in the Confederacy. Lincoln was a Republican. Republicans are not racist. Democrats are racist. Woodrow Wilson was a racist who screened Birth of the Nation at the White House. So, that there's some debate as to whether or not that's good faith, but is it possible that there are socially progressive Republicans who just think, hey, you know what? I don't really care that much about the social issues that Republicans and Democrats talk about. I have other issues. Although I am socially progressive and might not entirely agree with Republicans. For example, they might say, I support same-sex marriage, and I don't agree with the Republicans who say that we should overturn that Supreme Court decision. But you know what? Donald Trump was the first US president to come into office supporting same-sex marriage. In reality, Trump, of course, came into office saying he was okay with it because the Supreme Court had held that same-sex marriage was essentially the law of the land, that states banning same-sex marriage violates equal protection. So it's not really a good argument, but it's something people say. And all of these reasons that I'm giving, you can evaluate for yourself whether or not they're good reasons or good faith reasons, or whether or not they're just a facade for people to justify voting for a party for more malevolent reasons. There's also, of course, the issue with Republicans of, hey, I think that they're bad, but I think that the Democrats are worse. So there are right-wingers who are lesser of two evil voters, similar to those on the left. I just saw a post on X the other day. I hope you're ready for this. But they said Donald Trump is a liberal, J.D. Vance is a liberal, Mike Pence is a liberal, all this, Vivek Ramaswamy and Ron DeSantis are liberals. The whole establishment is liberals, but listen up, we have to vote for Republicans because the Democrats are communists. And, they would probably point to some stuff about Trump that they think is like, oh, he used to say he was pro-choice, all that. He held up the LGBT flag. Oh, Trump is a social justice warrior. So they whine and complain about how Republicans are actually too left-wing, but they're strategic. They sense that the Republican Party is better for their worldview than the Democratic Party. They line up with them more, even if by just 1% or 2%, and they vote for them. So yeah, that's basically the right-wing equivalent of those types on the left who are like, maybe they supported Bernie Sanders and they think Biden and Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris are war criminals and they have a hard time supporting them, but they suck it up because they're the lesser of two evils. So that exists. Then, there's people who are just low information voters. And let's face it, they exist on the Democratic side. They're probably more prominent on the Republican side. They probably are. So these are people who look at the Republican Party. They're like, well, I like the vibe that they give off. Their demeanor of patriotism, they make me feel good about my country. As I said, there are people on the Democratic side who felt that way about Obama and what have you. But there are plenty of people on the Republican side who are just like, man, the Republicans are the true patriots. Yeah, oh man, they're beautiful and, they represent the best of America. And, I don't know about the Democrats. They seem to hate America. So that's what they'll say. In large part, it comes down to vibes. I think that if you press them on why they think the Republicans are patriotic in their vibe and they just like them, they wouldn't be able to give you much. And that's all right. I mean, because all Americans are able to vote regardless of what their motivations are, and that's the way that things work in a democracy. But yeah, just know that exists. There, of course, are Republicans who are motivated by downright negative reasons. They may be racist. They may be misogynistic. They may be homophobic. I get the sense, and some of you might disagree with me though, that our country is gradually moving past racism, misogyny, and homophobia. I think that a lot of Republicans are not super bothered by the fact that someone is homosexual, someone is LGBT, whatever. They might not get bothered by the idea of voting for a candidate who is not of the same race as them. They think that women should have equal rights. They don't think that women are, less competent than men. But the fact remains that there are plenty of Republicans who think, you know what, I think I just want someone to put women in their place, someone to put minorities in their place, someone to put LGBTQ people back in the closet. So it is kind of that, not just concern about social issues, because I'm not saying that being conservative on social issues automatically makes you bigoted, but there are people who are somewhat motivated by bigotry, and it's just something that kind of wins them over. And there are Republican politicians, by the way, other than Trump, who have used sort of tacit bigotry in some of their campaigns. Consider this some of the stuff that people said about Obama. Now, I don't think Obama was perfect. I think there's plenty to criticize, but they said that he was a Kenyan, a guy born in Kenya, that he was Muslim. Like, the guy maintains that he was a Christian. There's really not any evidence that the guy was Muslim, but they just said, oh, well, close enough, right? We just don't like him, so we get to say whatever we want about him. And they didn't like he was black. There were plenty of like campaign ads, just posters attacking Obama on the basis of his race. It was a fringe minority, but it did exist. So there's that. There's also, and I can't believe I ended up saving this for last, but there's the religious aspect to it. Religion. The evangelical types, the non-evangelicals who are still really big about religion. They see Republicans as a party of God. They might believe that God helps get George W. Bush or Donald Trump elected. They might believe that, God doesn't like the Democrats or something, and abortion is murder. That's another huge thing. Abortion is one of their big issues. They'll vote for whoever is less pro-choice, more pro-life, what have you. There's also some of the issues, related to church and state. They're more interested in kind of creeping into theocratic territories. Maybe not quite, but definitely into politicians who are really, really, really pushing their religion on others. Politicians who openly profess to being religious. And you probably know this, but a lot of our presidents, vast majority, are religious, are Christian. So some of them were deists early on, but the thought to a lot of these evangelical types is the idea of having a non-Christian president could be concerning. They don't think that an atheist is someone who is moral, or even if they are moral, that they would be in touch with God to receive guidance to be president of the United States. It's also kind of an identity issue too. And I talked about Democrats being motivated by identity. Now I'm going to talk about Republicans a little more. I already talked about the race, gender, and sexuality thing, but a lot of people who are religious within the Republican Party want a president who they can relate to religiously. They think that they'd feel represented by them. And it kind of parallels what we see on the Democratic side of like, well, I am of a certain race. I would feel so represented if the president of the United States was also of that race. I'm not saying it's a good reason. It's not really a good reason either way to vote for a certain candidate. You should vote for a candidate based on what they will do for the country, based on how their platform compares with their opponents, based on whether or not they have the leadership skills to faithfully execute the laws of the United States and preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. So yeah, that's one of the weaker arguments for Republicans, religiosity. I admit that I'm biased because myself, I'm not religious, but if you're looking for an argument to try and convince me to vote Republican, then using religion is pretty much a non-starter. Sorry, we wouldn't be operating on the same wavelength. But yeah, this is my rundown of the Republicans' reasons to vote Republican, why Republican voters do what they do. I would also add immigration onto that, although that's also really big in Trump's territory too. There's a lot of overlap, concern about illegals invading our country. That's something Republicans always talk about, but it's mostly the MAGA Republican types. And I'm talking a little bit more about the traditional pre-Trump era Republican types. But as I wrap up, I'm really interested to hear in the comments, who do you think will be the Republican nominee in 2028? Let me know. Do you think it will be Ron DeSantis? Do you think it will be Vivek Ramaswamy? Do you think Marco Rubio is going to jump in there? J.D. Vance? I am really eager to see how the Republican Party reacts to the end of Trumpism, which could very well happen in this election. We're 4 days out from the election, guys. We can vanquish Trumpism once and for all and return to a pre-Trump Republican Party, which for all its flaws was not a cult, was not captured by one man, one con man. We can have more diversity of opinion within the Republican Party, less angry tweeting, less threats, less talk about terminating the Constitution. And maybe we'll actually hear about Republicans talking about how they like the Constitution again. Who knows? I used to consider myself a Republican. I don't anymore, but I was never a Republican while I was able to vote, so I have never voted Republican. So yeah, I was just speaking to what I think are the reasons that people vote Republican as of the early 2020s and late 2010s. But thank you so much for watching. I hope that you learned a thing or two about the Republican Party and what motivates their voters. I hope that you found this entertaining, interesting, insightful. And if you did, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to grow this channel. We've seen a lot of growth in the past couple of days, and I really like that. I like these videos about why people vote for certain stuff. I like talking about politics. I like talking about the law. I might do a 100 subscriber special, by the way, so that's coming up, possibly. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next video.